right, so now we want to put this all together to understand the autonomic nervous system, which is really important in pharmacology in general. You're going to see that this physiology, this concept, this basic science here is going to help you a lot with a lot of other drugs, okay? And pharmacology concepts. Okay, so a little quick review. We have the synapses here. Could be between a neuron and a neuron, which is basically here, this area. And this is called a ganglion. So when there's a synapse between a neuron and a neuron, we call it a ganglion, okay? And a synapse between just the neuron at the end here and a cell, just post-ganglionic. So we call this after the ganglion. This is preganglionic things, okay? Eventually, the action potential from the CNS wants to get to a cell at the end to give its give its signal for a motor function or give its order, okay? All right, so now I want you to notice here that I have this here question marks and another question mark. That's because we're going to see various things here. However, look at this area in the ganglion. Now, one thing I want to note here is that this is not necessarily anatomically correct, okay? We're not learning anatomy. This is, things don't move from the CNS in a straight line. It's not anatomy, it's pharmacologically correct. So we're looking at it as a logic concept, okay? So the neuron that's coming out from the CNS holding the action potential, when it wants to communicate here with the other neuron to transmit the signal, it always releases acetylcholine. So what do you think if I ask you what kind of receptor do I need here to understand the signal, right? Okay, imagine you're a repair person or an IT person. I'm asking you, look, the signal that's coming out from here is acetylcholine. I want it to continue through this neuron. What kind of receptor do I need here? You should say, at least what I want you to say is cholinergic. It has to be cholinergic to continue to receive that signal and transmit the action potential through the second neuron. Now, it happens to be, it's not only cholinergic, but it is always nicotinic. So nicotinic, remember cholinergic, there's two receptors, muscarinic and nicotinic. So this is always nicotinic. Now, we call this nicotinic, and sometimes we put an N beside it just to refer that it's nicotinic on a neuron, because you're going to see later on there's also another nicotinic on muscles. So we call this nicotinic neuron. Okay, so that means the ganglion, right, this area, is always acetylcholine and nicotinic connection. Okay, that's the kind of connection we have here. Okay, so the action potential continues through this neuron. It releases a neurotransmitter. Depending on which transmitter, it will affect the receptor and will cause an effect. And the cells could have several effects, effect 1, effect 2, depending on which kind of neurotransmitter is released, for example. Okay, so let's expand this a bit. Okay, now we have the parasympathetic system and the sympathetic system. You probably heard of these before. So as you see, what we're starting from small and we're expanding. So you have the autonomic nervous system is the system that is controlling itself. It doesn't need your manual control. It's autonomic. It's on autopilot. It's working on itself, such as the dilation of the pupils, for example, the blood vessels, how they dilate and constrict, the heartbeat. Like these things are you're not thinking how to control them, right? They're being controlled automatically, right? Which we should be grateful for, because if we have to manage them, we'll probably be dead by now, right? Imagine that every time you worked out, you're like, I have to increase my heart rate to this level. I have to reduce this. Oh man, that would be terrible. So good thing they're automatic. And that's what we call the autonomous nervous system. So let me show you what we know so far. Okay, there's something called the nervous system. Well, actually, it's probably all of it. So nervous system. The nervous system is split into CNS, the central nervous system, which is basically brain and spinal cord. Okay. And then you have the peripheral nervous system. So this includes all kind of the nerves that work outside the CNS. The peripheral nervous system could be autonomic, or this is called automatic. So ANS, autonomic nervous system, or somatic, which means the one you control, okay? For example, if I want to move my arm, that's part of the somatic nervous system, right? So it's still a connection from here to here using certain neurotransmitters, but it's not automatically controlled. So it's still part of the peripheral nervous system. And then you have the autonomic. Now, the autonomic nervous system is split into the parasympathetic, PANS, and the sympathetic, ANS. Now, the sympathetic is the one, just to summarize, that's activated when you're, excited, okay? So the fight and flight, you're scared, you're trying to run away, you're in a fight, you're exercising, all that is part of sympathetic. The parasympathetic is the opposite. You're relaxed, things are calm, you're more calm. It's the opposite, okay? So now we have hopefully a good view about these two. Just a little summary of them. So now the orders of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic come out from the CNS. So imagine, because you might have heard something in anatomy where it's like there's parasympathetic fibers, and some of you may be still confused about that. What does that mean? So parasympathetic fibers means they carry a signal, a parasympathetic signal that calms the body or something. So it depends on the function of that organ. So now the parasympathetic neuron, there's a neuron, let's say in a nerve, let's say the facial nerve has parasympathetic fibers. These fibers go through the facial nerve. There's a signal from the CNS, because CNS is giving this automatic order, right? It doesn't need to be controlled. And it's going through, and it's meeting it's another neuron in the ganglion to send over to transmit the signal here. What's happening here? Always, as we said, ACH, acetylcholine, and nicotine. So now these here release acetylcholine. They connect to nicotinic receptors. The signal continues through the neuron. At the end here, in a parasympathetic nerve or fiber, it will release acetylcholine. The acetylcholine will then trigger muscarinic receptors. So the cholinergic receptors, remember, this is cholinergic and this is cholinergic. But the cholinergic receptors on the end cell, like the glands, the smooth muscles, are usually muscarinic receptors. So now the acetylcholine goes and triggers the muscarinic and causes, for example, let's say we're targeting a gland, it will cause it to secrete. Okay, so increased secretions. Okay, now we have the sympathetic nervous system. These fibers will carry the signal, and even though they're sympathetic, they still release acetylcholine, okay, in the ganglionic area, and they connect with the nicotine, and then that signal will transmit to this neuron, and then at the end they release norepinephrine, and norepinephrine, how is it going to speak to the cell? It needs to target alpha or beta receptors. Okay, so you can see here the main concept is that the sympathetic nervous system, okay, the neurons that are carrying its signal end with norepinephrine, and the parasympathetic end with acetylcholine. Both of them use acetylcholine as a middle messenger, just to transmit the signal from a neuron to neuron. Okay, so yeah, the way to communicate a neuron to another neuron is always acetylcholine and nicotine. Think of it like that. We just put an N beside it to make sure it's like kind of notable that it's nicotinic on a neuron. Okay, now to make sure this is clear, okay, I'm going to give you an example. It's not necessarily an accurate anatomical example. It's just an example to help you understand. So let's say here is the gland. This is a gland, okay? This gland, let's say, makes secretions. Okay. Now, this may be different than how you would have engineered things, but there's probably a reason why it's engineered. We're made this way. So the parasympathetic system will have fibers that will go to the gland, and what they would do if the parasympathetic is working, it will stimulate the gland to increase secretions. Okay? Now the sympathetic system, okay, has its own fibers connecting to the gland. And when it's stimulated, it will cause a decrease in secretions. You see? This is just an example. Okay? So as you see here, we don't have an on and off button. It's like we almost have two separate systems. One is doing something, the other one is doing the opposite. Now, you might say, well, how do we get a secretion or not? Well, the thing is, usually they're not working at the same time. So when you're in a state of relaxation, who's working? The parasympathetic system. So it's the one that's activating the gland. It's the one that's pushing the gland to secrete, so that you want to go eat, you're making secretions to digest food. But if you're scared and you're running away, your sympathetic nervous system works, and your parasympathetic, let's say, shuts up for a bit, and your sympathetic works, and it will reduce your secretions. Maybe, I don't care why, I'm not going to go into the reasoning of why, but mainly it shuts down your secretions. Okay, maybe because you need to save that for your blood, so you can increase your blood pressure. I don't care, but basically that's how it kind of works. Another way that it could work is sometimes you don't need the sympathetic for the gland connection. You could just make it an on and off button. So when the parasympathetic is on, secretions will increase, but when it's off, it just won't secrete. Okay, you don't need something to actively reduce secretions. Another example, let's say the heart, and this one is not 100% accurate, but let's say, let's not draw any neurons to make sure it's accurate. So the PNS, the parasympathetic, will cause, when it's stimulated, a decrease in heart rate, right? And a decrease in blood pressure in general. The sympathetic nervous system, when it's activated, it causes an increase in heart rate and an increase in blood pressure. Okay, so that's how that will work. Now, the reason I'm not drawing anything is because actually the sympathetic nervous system doesn't connect directly to the heart. The parasympathetic connects to the heart. So that's a surprise probably to some of you. And the parasympathetic, through I think it's the vagus nerve, but it connects to the heart and releases, stimulates muscarinic receptors to lower the heart rate. So naturally, the on and off button is here. So when the parasympathetic is on, it's reducing the heart rate to keep it normal. However, when it's off, then the heart rate is going to go up because the heart naturally wants to beat faster. And if you go and turn the sympathetic on, then epinephrine is released into the blood, and that will get to the heart eventually. So you don't have to know this right now, but it's kind of good if you want to rewind, just kind of understand that concept as well. But the concept here, the main thing I'm trying to get at is, it's not like an organ is either connected to one of these, it's not like an organ has to be only connected to one of these. One organ could be connected to both and be controlled by both, and based on who's leading the body right now, the organ will follow. So if it's a parasympathetic time the body's going through, the organs will follow its lead. Depending, and if it's a sympathetic system time, then the organs will follow whatever that sympathetic wants. Okay, so let's see what we could conclude from these. Are the two parts where you have to understand the differences here, and then we're going to add some more, because you might notice now in your book, or you have a little bit more things if you're reading the book. So nicotinic receptors on neuron, there's two of them, one on neuron and there's one on muscular, we're going to see later. Just a reminder, the parasympathetic autonomic nervous system decreases heart rate. The sympathetic increases heart rate. Now, here's a rule I want you to know. This is very important. Stimulating muscarinic receptors will cause secretion of all glands. Okay? So when the parasympathetic is working,
and the acetylcholine stimulates muscarinic receptors, the glands will secrete. That's the rule. So here's an interesting thing. Okay, let me take you to another slide. So if I could make a drug, okay, a drug. Let me draw you here in red. Red seems like a good color here. So if I could make a drug that the body takes, okay, here's my drug, and this drug could go and stimulate muscarinic receptors. What will that cause? Will it cause increased secretions or decrease? Your answer should be increase. If I could make a drug, and now I'm going to use maybe, let's use, what kind of color should I use? Orange. If I could make a drug, okay, that goes to the muscarinic and blocks them, okay, it blocks, actually, I'm just going to use, there, it blocks the muscarinic receptors. And that way, acetylcholine from your neurons cannot stimulate the muscarinic. What's going to happen? What will happen to your secretions? Obviously, they will decrease. So blocking muscarinic receptors will cause dry mouth. Stimulating muscarinic receptors could actually treat xerostomia and dry mouth. So you see so any drug that has a muscarinic blocker effect will cause dry mouth. Any drug that has a muscarinic stimulating effect will cause increased salivation. All right, so I'm glad we understand these two here. Let's add another one. Here's a unique thing. Now, we said there's a rule. The rule is if you stimulate muscarinic, if you give something that could stimulate muscarinic receptors, so I want you to imagine that you have muscarinic receptors. They're all over the place in the body. They may be on this gland, on the salivary glands, and the intestinal glands, they're all over the body. So if you could give a drug that goes all over the body and stimulates them, it will cause increased secretions from all of these glands. Okay, that's a rule. Glands only want to speak muscarinic. They don't want to use another language. Okay, glands only want to speak muscarinic. They don't want to learn anything new. That's all. However, all the glands are stimulated by the parasympathetic nervous system. But there's one gland that we actually don't want it to be stimulated by the parasympathetic nervous system. Can you think of it? Which gland do we actually want to work during the sympathetic nervous system? Which gland do we want working when I'm running, when I'm, doing exercise, right? Which gland do I want to work under the sympathetic? The sweat gland, okay? So the sweat gland is the one that breaks the rules here a bit. So the sweat gland is the only gland that increases secretions under the sympathetic stimulation. So it's under control. When the sympathetic is on, sweat glands work. When the parasympathetic is on, all the other glands work. So imagine that, another way to understand this autonomic nervous system, it's not like, your light in the room where you have an on and off button, okay? You have two buttons. Each one has an on and off. Think of it like that. So usually, when we turn the parasympathetic on, the sympathetic, we turn that off. Usually, this is what we do. And when we turn the parasympathetic off, or when we turn the sympathetic on, we turn the parasympathetic off. So it's that's the usual, okay? So when we turn the parasympathetic on, all the glands secrete except the sweat gland. We don't want you to sweat while you're sitting relaxed, right? If you're sitting getting ready to eat, we don't want you to start sweating. We want the sweat glands to turn on to work when the sympathetic is on. However, there is a rule we talked about that we said all glands only talk muscarinic, right? All glands speak muscarinic. They don't want the change. But the sympathetic system usually releases norepinephrine at the end. And norepinephrine and muscarinic don't work. Isn't that crazy? So here, imagine that the sweat glands are negotiating a deal with the sympathetic system. And they're saying, look, You guys want us to be on your team, right? Because you need us. You need the sweat glands to work in the sympathetic. You have to make us a separate electrical line to talk to us in our way. We speak only muscarinic. So the sympathetic system said, all right, okay, we'll do that. So they created a new type of fibers. Let's just say, I'm just talking in a way to help you memorize it. The ganglionic area is always the same, you see, that never changes. But the end release is acetylcholine to muscarinic. This is the only area where you'll find the sympathetic system, when it works, its fibers, it's actually releasing acetylcholine. So you're finding that sympathetic fibers are releasing acetylcholine. That's unique. Usually sympathetic fibers release norepinephrine at the end, and parasympathetic fibers release acetylcholine. Both of them release acetylcholine in the middle, in the ganglions, but it's the end that's different. However, for the sweat glands, because the sympathetic was desperate to get the sweat glands on its side, it will release acetylcholine at the end. So that's a unique case, okay? Now, the sympathetic has one more tool it could use when it's turned on, okay? So imagine the sympathetic system is kind of like a bigger corporation, has more things, it has more tools to use. The sympathetic system connects to, instead of connecting here with another neuron, actually connects with an endocrine gland. Ooh, so what do you think that endocrine gland is? And you can see here, the mechanism is still the same, acetylcholine to nicotine. And that endocrine gland is the adrenal medulla. So when your sympathetic system is on, there's a quick signal that goes to all of these, and one of them goes to the adrenal medulla so that it releases epinephrine into the blood. That's why epinephrine is considered a hormone. Look at the difference here in how we drew this. Acetylcholine and norepinephrine, they're going specifically to target these receptors on cells. Epinephrine is released in the blood. So when epinephrine is released in the blood, it will circulate the entire body looking for adrenergic cells and stimulating them. So norepinephrine and epinephrine both will stimulate adrenergic cells. Norepinephrine targets it specifically. So imagine like it goes to a specific cell and targets it based on where the streets take it. So basically imagine these are wired connections, and based wherever you have electricity going, norepinephrine will go to those cells from the sympathetic connections. But epinephrine is not released through these wired systems. It goes into the blood, which means it could go all over the body and access more cells. Okay. Now you might think this is very weird. Why is this connected to this gland? Well, let me remind you of something. In endocrine, we have the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland makes a hormone that triggers other glands to release their hormones. So it makes a hormone like the thyroxine releasing hormone. So it goes to the thyroid, and the thyroid releases the thyroxine. Or let's just say T3, T4. Okay, that's the hormone for the thyroid. The pituitary gland releases another hormone that goes, for example, to the adrenal cortex. Now remember, the adrenal gland is divided into cortex, the outer part, and the medulla, the inside, and both function very differently. Okay? Now, the adrenal cortex will release cortisol. So let me show you what's happening here. The way you release hormones usually works from chemical signaling. So for you to release cortisol, you have to wait for the pituitary to chemically communicate with the adrenal cortex. So it's sending a hormone. The hormone has to go through the body, get to the adrenal cortex, tell the adrenal cortex, hey, you have to start making cortisol, then it makes cortisol. The pituitary gland, okay, you need thyroxine, you need the thyroid to start working. The pituitary gland is going to make its hormone. It's a chemical message. It's writing its letter. It sends the letter out to the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland receives it, goes, oh, okay, you want me to make thyroxine now? I will do that. So it makes it. That's too slow for adrenaline.
When you're in a fight and flight state, you can't wait for that. You can't wait. So the way it works is that the adrenal medulla, which releases epinephrine, okay, so this releases adrenaline or epinephrine, same meaning, okay? Epinephrine. So if we say adrenaline, it means epinephrine. When we say noradrenaline, it's the same as norepinephrine. So the adrenal medulla releases epinephrine. We can't wait for the pituitary to go make a hormone, send its letter. You'd be, if you needed to survive, you'd be dead by then, right? We respond faster when we're in a fight and flight situation. We're very quick at, when we get afraid, we're very quick at becoming, you know, we get that adrenaline shot and then we react quickly. So how does that happen? It's because your sympathetic turns on and it's connected. Imagine it's electrically connected, right? It's electrically connected to the adrenal medulla. So that's why your adrenal response is so much faster than all these other hormones, okay? This is chemical signaling, you know? It's like sending a letter in the post office. This is electrical signaling. It's internet. It goes right away to the adrenal gland. The adrenal medulla releases epinephrine and starts working. So it's really unique. It's cool to understand it that way, that you won't forget it. The adrenal medulla specifically is connected to the sympathetic nervous system with electrical connection, not chemical only. So it's neuron that gets there, doesn't need to wait for a hormone to release epinephrine. It gets stimulated right away so that you release the epinephrine. Okay? And here's a little note. Epinephrine stimulates beta-2 receptors. Norepinephrine does not. Is the picture complete? There's one more thing to complete the peripheral nervous system, because we said the peripheral nervous system is the automatic part and the somatic part, which means the part you could control. And that's what the last part is. So the somatic part has nothing to do with the PANS or the SNS. It's separate. It's somatic. So I'm going to put here somatic, right? So if you divide, and sorry, I know here it says CNS, so I don't want you to think that this is under the CNS system. It's just, you know, it starts off from the CNS, but this is called the peripheral nervous system, okay? Because we're looking at this part, you see? This part. That's all peripheral stuff outside the CNS. Yeah, but everything starts as an origin from the CNS. So the somatic means if I want to move my muscle, my arm, this is something I manually move. It's not automatic. So this is called alpha motor neuron or lower motor neuron. And there's no ganglion here. And you can see it goes like this. And it's a straight signal all the way to the muscle, the skeletal muscle. And the connection here is basically acetylcholine and a cholinergic, because it's acetylcholine. But which cholinergic is actually nicotinic? And we put an M beside it just to refer nicotinic on the muscle, just to differentiate it from this nicotinic if we ever had to. Okay? Isn't that cool? So if I give someone a drug, if I invent a drug to block this receptor, the person will become paralyzed. They can't move their voluntary muscles. But they may be able to move. They're going to be able to control the muscarinic stuff. You see, because those are not, so their heart will still beat. The glands will still work because those are controlled by muscarinic receptors. If I create a nicotinic muscular blocker specifically, then the person will become paralyzed. So understanding how all these buttons work, imagine they're buttons and each button causes something in the system. You could either push the button or block the button to prevent it from being pushed. And that will have an effect as well. Okay, so that completes our picture here for the peripheral nervous system. So remember, the peripheral nervous system is both somatic, which means the ones you could control, and the autonomic, which is DNS, and this could be parasympathetic or sympathetic. Okay, and a lot of pharmacology will deal with this, but mainly all of it is important in pharmacology. Okay, and that's pretty much it. Now you understand. This is one of the most important things to know from this. If there's nothing else you want to study from all of this, and you just want to study one thing, this is probably the most thing that's going to help you with pharmacology specifically, because it will really help you understand pharmacology. You have to know how to draw this. That's what I recommend. If you could go and every day review how to draw this, which neurotransmitters are released where and what receptors there are in that area, you will become it will help you a lot with pharma. The next step in pharmacology is to learn the physiology of each receptor. So if you stimulate muscarine, what happens to the body? If you stimulate alpha 1, what happens to the body? If you stimulate beta 1, what happens to the body? All this is important. We do that in pharmacology. I'm going to give you some quick tips here to know the most important things in the following slide there. But for now, we're going to end our autonomic nervous system section.